today is April 12th, 2017, part 3 of Kevin Brown's interview. I'm interviewing him at his office in Uncas Hill, Connecticut. Kevin, we left off part 2 where you had just moved to Fort Benning for the advanced training. You decided to stay in the service. So can you pick up from that point and tell me what that training was like and how long?
Yeah, that was a pretty basic step in an officer's career where you return back to your commissioning or your branch specific school location, which for infantry is Fort Benning, to get the next dose. So it was a roughly an 8-month, I think, course. I signed in July of 91, and I signed out in February of 92. So however many months that is. And it's, you spend a lot of time in what used to be known as Building 4 down there, where Iron Mike, stands in front of the building saying, "Follow me." You go through a lot of classroom training. In the advanced course, there is very little field training that occurs other than the standard trip out to Yankee Road, which everyone who's been to Fort Benning knows is the land navigation course location. But much of the rest of the course is preparing you to operate as a company commander and staff officer at the battalion level. You write a lot of operations orders. You learn about the capabilities of all of the weapon systems in the infantry and how to employ them.
You were trained to be a staff officer, then you planned on staying in at this point. Did you expect us, the United States, to stay in war?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't think any of us really saw the future. I didn't, anyway. I'll say that at that point. I mean, look, my undergraduate degree at West Point was in aerospace engineering. I spent a lot of time in the books and the calculators learning aerodynamics and how to build a helicopter. I admittedly wasn't a deeply enriched historian by any stretch. Now, with the experience of a couple of years under my belt and everything else, the conflict in the Gulf, as many people recognize, didn't end cleanly. We left Saddam Hussein in power. In fact, it was during my time in the advanced course that I learned from my instructor, my small group instructor, Edge Gibbons, what the war plans were had the conflict in the Persian Gulf continued. He was actually one of the Third Army war planners, and told all of us in the classroom that and I knew this because we were preparing for it, but then everything stopped. Had the conflict in the Gulf continued, the next thing that would have happened is the 101st Airborne Division that I was in would have air assaulted into Baghdad, with the 3rd Armored Division coming up Highway 8 to link up with them to seize Baghdad. So it would have been the 3rd Armored Division and the 101st Airborne Division in the main effort. So that was pretty enlightening to hear that from him, because I'll just tell you what anybody could figure out. Had we done that in 1991, it would have been all the same stuff that we just experienced these last 10 years. Fighting in the cities, toppling a regime, long-standing requirement to put lots of boots on the ground. And so I'm sure all of those things were reasons why George Bush at the time made the decision that he did. And, hindsight being 2020, there are some who might realize that maybe that was the best thing. The funny thing about learning that when I was in the advanced course is it sort of, put some context around something that we were doing in the last forward operating base that we were in before we got the call that the war had ended. And we were literally, with my friend Nick Plant that I talked about earlier, who was the battalion maintenance officer, who knew the ins and outs of how every vehicle operated. We were teaching kids how to hotwire civilian vehicles. in the event that we got into Baghdad and needed to do that. And I don't know if I shared this in the last interview, but my driver was a young man named Roderick McDonald. He was from Detroit. And when they were teaching us how to hotwire cars, he said to me, "Don't worry about it, sir. I got this covered." And he showed me where he'd been shot through his shoulder when he was stealing a car in Detroit. I loved the kid. I mean, that's what happens in the Army, right? You bring people together from all walks of life. You have a common mission and a common goal, and you get it done. And you don't look at somebody for the color of their skin or where they came from or what their religion is. And I thought that was pretty funny when he told me that. And I also knew I was in good hands. So, just one of those things. At any rate, that's something that happened during my time in the advanced course. Other than that, it was a pretty uneventful, boring classroom tour.
Did you increase in rank at the end of that training?
Actually, in the middle of it, just by the calendar. At that time, all first lieutenants became eligible for promotion to captain at, I believe it was their 46th month of service or something like that. That happened to be in October while I was there at Fort Benning. So for the most part, the entire class, all got promoted on generally the same day, plus or minus 30 or 60 days to the rank of captain.
Where did you go after that training?
When I made the deal with the devil to say, "Hey, can I hurry up and go down to Fort Benning?" and the guy said, "Yeah, go ahead," I had to also accept the follow-on assignment that the guy whose spot I took had. And there were 2 officers in my battalion who were not going to go to the advanced course. So he said, "Okay, pick one of theirs. You'll get their advanced course slot and you'll get their follow-on assignment." And it was a matter of much consternation on the home front with my then spouse and 2 young children. Not that they were in the boat. Because the options were Fort Hood, Texas or Fairbanks, Alaska. And I wanted to go to Fairbanks, Alaska. I wanted to go to the light infantry unit that was there. I didn't really want to go to the mechanized infantry at the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. But she did not want to take 2 young'uns to the extremes of Alaska, and I bent on that. I said, okay. And so Fort Hood, Texas was the destination. For a short period of time between Fort Benning and Fort Hood, I stopped in at Fort Knox, Kentucky for the Junior Maintenance Officer course, which is a transition course to help young officers who had previously been in a light infantry unit where the only thing you really had to care for was your weapon, your night vision goggles, your rappel rope, and your rappel gloves, and your compass. You were going to go from being a platoon leader with that kind of equipment to being company commander with 14 armored vehicles and 3 Humvees and millions of dollars worth of other stuff. So the Junior Maintenance Officer course was a good stopover. Along with, I also took, I forgot, the Bradley Fighting Vehicle course right there at Fort Benning. So those were the 2 interim courses on my way to Fort Hood that I took, and ultimately I landed in Texas in April of 1992.
And how long did you stay in Texas, and exactly what was your training like during that period?
So back to your earlier question about did we think that we would go off to war again. I had just left the 101st Airborne Division, part of the 18th Airborne Corps, part of the Rapid Deployment Force for our United States Army, where you kept the rucksack packed all the time and you left your duffel bag packed in the supply room all the time so that if you had to go, you could load up and go in what we used to call the 18-hour sequence. Now I'm at Fort Hood, Texas, with all this stuff and armored vehicles, and I'm in the middle of the continental United States. So it's my belief that I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. It takes too much. We saw how much it took during the Gulf War to get those units deployed and in theater and all that. So I thought, well, this is a whole different world. I signed in. I took over as the battalion supply officer, the battalion S4, and immediately went to the field on a gunnery exercise for about, 2 or 3 weeks, I guess. Came back from that, and about a week after that, my battalion commander called me in and said, how'd you like to take command of a company? And I said, yes, that's what we all want. So I was only a staff officer for a short period of time, about six weeks probably. And then I took over my company in late May, early June. About 2 or 3 weeks after I took command, and this is in the days before the cell phones that we have now, I was sitting at home. My wife was in the commissary at Fort Hood doing some shopping, and the phone on the wall, when those used to be, rang, and it was my battalion commander. Now, from my days in the 101st, the joke was Eagle Anvil. That's all I have to say. You hang up the phone, you come in, you draw your rifle, you pack your stuff, and you go to the airfield, and you go wherever you're supposed to go, training, deployment, otherwise. It's my battalion commander on the phone, and he's saying to me, this is on a Saturday, hey, I need you to come to the office. I think we're going to deploy you to Kuwait. So I said, okay. So I called the commissary. They paged my wife. She parked the shopping carts. She came home. I went to the office, and I found out that within about, and I can't recall anymore, but I'll say within about 3 weeks of that phone call, we were going to deploy my company to Kuwait as part of Operation Southern Watch, which became, and that Operation Southern Watch was the no-fly enforcement that was going on in the southern part of Iraq after the Persian Gulf War. They decided they needed ground troops to be on the border and be prepared for any sort of ground conflict that might ensue if an aircraft was shot down, if Saddam continued his saber rattling, all those kinds of things. And so they took what was going to be a training rotation of 2 tank companies and 1 mechanized infantry company that had been planned for months, and they turned it into an emergency deployment, and they added 1 more mechanized infantry company, and it happened to be mine. So, here I was again, loading up and going away, having just gotten back, a little respite there at the advanced course, and off I went again. And it's funny because over the last 10 years of conflict, dwell time has become a well-known phrase. The time in between deployments. And Robert Gates, when he was the Secretary of Defense, set a red line. Said, if anyone breaches a 1-for-1 on their dwell time, I personally have to approve it. So if you deployed, and this is in the most recent 10 years of conflict, if you deployed for 8 months, you had to be home for at least 8 months. If you deployed for 15 months, you had to be home for 15 months. That all occurred in the 2006-2007 timeframe, when they began to recognize that soldiers were not coming home and unwinding and having enough time between deployments. Roll the clock back on that. There I was, and I had not been home right about that same amount of time, and now I'm going back again. Nobody cared about that stuff back then. But anyway, so it's like I told my soldiers before we deployed to Baghdad. When my dad, as a 17-year-old, got sent to Germany during World War II, nobody said to him, this is going to be a 12-month deployment and you'll get a 12-month rest after it's over. That's just not how we operate.
When you went over, you went straight to Baghdad?
So, no. So this is, now remember, this is after the Persian Gulf in 1992. And so Operation Southern Watch / Intrinsic Action, that was the very, very first rotation. Those Operation Intrinsic Action force deployments continued all the way up until March of 2003, when it transitioned into Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I was on the very first Operation Intrinsic Action rotation. And the 1st Cavalry Division continued to support that by deploying troops for a few months at a time, cyclically. They transitioned that over or traded it off with the 3rd Infantry Division, and it was the 3rd Infantry Division that was in Kuwait at the time. It was a deployment to Kuwait, to a place called Camp Monterey, which is about, I've lost track, but I'll estimate maybe 30 miles north of Kuwait City, out in the desert. Old Iraqi base camp. And basically we had our basic mission. And again, I was on the first one. So, anybody you talk to that was on number 5 or 10 or 12 or 18 probably had a pretty tight mission statement. We were figuring it out. And so basically what I would say we were doing is we were beginning to establish what some old vets would remember that was called the GDP, the German Defense Plan in Europe. Knowing where your positions were that you would go to with your vehicles, with your equipment, with your soldiers to defend Kuwait. I think we were sort of, as a matter of analogy, developing the KDP, the Kuwaiti Defense Plan. We were there. If something happened, where were we going to go? How were we going to fight? What were we going to do? So we landed there, late summer. I think it was by the time the notification and the deployment sequence and everything, I think it was late July that we got into Kuwait. And we had no idea how long we were going to be there. There was no discussion frankly, of what we were going to do or how long we were going to be there. There was, and I told this story a number of times over my career, but the generals were more concerned about what color boots we had issued and what our dental category was for deployment than telling us what our mission was on the ground. And that sounds a little bit harsh, but I'm just telling you, as a young company commander, that's kind of how it felt to me at that time. So we hit the ground and we drew what was called POMKIS stock, preparation for overseas movement outside of the continental United States or something like that, equipment, pre-positioned, pre-POD equipment that had been left there after the Gulf War at Camp Doha in Kuwait. We in-processed in Kuwait, we pulled the equipment out, and then we commenced on a road march north to Camp Monterey. And as every good war story goes, without the profane, no kidding, there I was. One of the debates was with my master gunner and a couple of my leaders, and I'm just a young company commander. I mean, I'm not a battalion commander, or brigade commander. I'm like, hey, I think we ought to fly the American flag. So here I go. I'm the lead vehicle of this American convoy of the very first intrinsic action rotation, and I'm trucking up the highway towards Iraq with the American flag flying. It was pretty cool. Went under an overpass. Kuwaitis were out there waving and all that kind of stuff. So that was all pretty neat. We got settled in Camp Monterey, and then we just began a cycle of training there on the base camp, where I put my soldiers through some MOUT training, military operations in urban terrain, basically house-to-house fighting training. And then we would load up in our Bradley fighting vehicles and convoy out into the desert and conduct maneuver training and live fire training. In a lot of ways, and a lot of times in my career, I feel like Forrest Gump. I mean, I have instances that it's funny on reflection to think that I was there and that I did that or this. There aren't too many other people in the Army or on the face of the planet today who can say that they built Udari Range. Today, because of the 10 to 12 years of troops cycling in and out of Iraq, one of the things you do in the year 2006 or 7 or 10 or 11, when you go to Kuwait, you get your equipment, you get hydrated, you get accustomed to the climate, and then you go out to this range complex called Udari Range. Well, my guys were the first ones to go out there and actually do live fires on that range. Just kind of life coming full circle, bizarre kind of thing.
Were you the first ones to establish Camp Monterey, or was that already in existence?
Well, it was a hard stand. It wasn't tents or anything. It was a hard stand camp that the Iraqi army had previously occupied. Where they went when we were there, or when the last time was they were there, I really can't say. I mean, but we occupied their barracks rooms. We had a mess hall, command posts. We used that whole facility. Some of them were co-located in another corner on the south side of the camp, but it wasn't. This was not a large camp. It was probably 300 yards by 300 yards. So just this little square. I mean, you can go on a Google map and find Camp Monterey, 30 miles north of Kuwait, and you see that square sitting there. So we spent equal time between on the camp and out on the range, and we did all kinds of hairy live fires out there because there were no rules. We were making it up. And we did some pretty fun and exciting stuff. which culminated, I guess, in, you could say, in a large scale combined arms live fire exercise that had every possible munition and weapon system integrated into it that you could think of. French Mirage fighter jets dropping ordnance. Puma helicopters flown by Kuwaitis dropping ordnance. American Cobra helicopters, Bradley fighting vehicles, M1 tanks, mine-clearing crater charges to blow breaches through wire. Something called a CEV that no longer, I think, exists in the Army's inventory, which fired what was called a HEP round. It's just this big hunk of high explosives that you use for bunker busting, and it had this concussive aftershock. We employed all that stuff in this cool live fire, right down to infantrymen getting out of back of Bradley fighting vehicles and clearing a trench line to end the exercise. And we did all this for many reasons. One being, demonstrating to Saddam Hussein, hey, the Americans are here, they're prepared, they're doing what they do, and don't cross the border. Another being just sort of exercising that pre-positioned stock of equipment so it didn't sit dormant in Doha. Those were probably two strategic and operational objectives of it. And then a national security strategy approach that young company commander really didn't probably understand or get at the time was, during that live fire, there's this big tent set up on a big hill and a bunch of Kuwaitis in flowing robes. And we were literally shopping our military hardware to them for them to consider purchasing. So
Did you know that at the time?
I kind of did because they rolled some British tanks out and our tanks out, and we kind of knew that there was this sort of a shopping thing going on. So all that was being achieved by that exercise. It's the time in terms of storytelling, and then we'll move on to maybe the next phase of life. It was a time when I learned about, as a company commander, having many different levers to pull and things to do in the midst of that very complicated and high-end live fire exercise. How to be patient with subordinates on the radio, and what happens when you're not. I lost my temper and therefore got yelled at by General Abrams, who was viewing the exercise with all the people in the flowing robes and listening to my radio channel at the same time. Had a young engineer platoon leader. He was supposed to fire this cool MICLIC, mine clearing line charge. Mine clearing line charge. The acronym was MICLIC, and what it essentially was a rope of C4 explosives that were connected and coiled in a trailer to a rocket that you pull the trigger and the rocket shoots out. And it extends this coiled line of C4, which probably was, 50 meters long. And it lands. Boom. And it's on the ground. And now it's armed. And now the engineer platoon leader flips the switch and boom, it blows up. And it blows up any obstacle that it landed on. So it clears mines that by percussion or concussive effect. Clears mines, blows up wire, creates a path for you to continue moving with all your equipment. And so young Sapper 6 moves up to the thing, and the call sign and the code over the radio was tremor, 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 which meant everyone get down, button up, because this thing's about to blow up, and then we're going to hit on the gas pedal. We're going to get through. So he says tremor, and he was kind of a gangly kid, young lieutenant. I mean, I was only a captain, but he was younger than me, and lieutenant, and new and stuff. And tremor, tremor, tremor. I'm waiting. Nothing. Sapper 6, this is Warrior 6. What's going on down there? Sir, we had a problem with the blah, blah, blah. We're doing misfire procedures. We should be doing it again momentarily. Tremor, tremor, tremor. Waiting. Nothing. Sapper 6, this is Warrior 6. That's Strike 2. What's going on down there? Sir, we had a problem with the da-da-da-da-da-da. Tremor, tremor, tremor. Nothing. Now, this whole time, we're losing the momentum of this whole exercise with all of this integrated air power and artillery, mortars, everything. So I said, this is the last chance, Chief, and I kind of got on him. And I yelled at him, hey, I don't know what you're doing, but I'm about to bypass this entire obstacle because you are disrupting the flow of this operation. It went off, boom, we went through, went on and finished it. General Abrams yelled at me later for yelling at him. Now, anyone who knows the Abrams family and their legendary behavior, they like to yell at people too. but it was a lesson in, in the midst of difficult circumstances on the radio, the last thing you need to do or should do is yell at somebody on the radio. And believe me, that was 1992. In 2005, 6, 7, 8, I got that. And I did not do that. But when it was necessary, you do. And every now and then there are those times. But anyway.
How many months were you at Camp on?
We came home on Halloween. So about 90-something days we were there. And again, the whole time we never really, it was every couple of weeks it was, so do we know we're going home yet? No. We just kept rolling forward. We came home. I don't think we were relieved. I think that was the end of the mission. And then they realized a month or two later, hey, this has got to be a sustained operation. And then they started cycling troops over there all the time. So came back Halloween night, went out on Halloween night. Christmas time, and then right back at it. Gunnery, NTC rotation. And Fort Hood at that time, for a guy coming out of the light infantry, it was just a very different experience. It was.
So when you came back, you were stationed at Fort Hood?
At Fort Hood, Texas. 1st Cavalry Division, 1st Brigade, 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment. And I commanded a company. Some would say, don't you mean troop if it was a cavalry squadron? But back then, it was a company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry.
When you were at Fort Hood, what would you do? Was it all training every day?
Yeah, it was a relatively high op tempo training regimen there. You were either in the field maneuvering your battalion, or you were at gunnery conducting live fires, or you were shipping off to the National Training Center for an NTC rotation in the desert out at Fort Irwin. And then rinse and repeat, nonstop.
How long did you stay at Fort Hood on that time?
So from the April that I signed in 1992, I was there until May of 94. I commanded my company for 20. I was there for 26 months. I commanded my company for 24 months, which was a little bit unusual back then. You typically commanded a company for no less than 12 months, but probably for 18 months. And just because of the deployment, because I guess I was doing a halfway decent job at it, I stayed in command until May. And then my next assignment came as a result of the Army's desire to make sure that everyone had a secondary specialty at that time. Functional area is what they called it. And my functional area was assigned to me. I didn't exactly necessarily choose it. I became a 49, functional area 49, which is operations research and systems analysis. And again, I didn't even know what all that meant. But to me, it was just an entry on my officer record brief and whatever. Didn't mean anything to me. And then, no kidding, in the world of Army storytelling, I am out on the front lawn in front of our company orderly room where we marked off a playing field, and I'm playing American ball, which was essentially kill the man with the ball like you played in elementary school, except you were in combat boots and your flak vest, and people were really kind of hurting each other, throwing each other around. So I'm out there doing what, rugged infantrymen do, and I had literally just been thrown to the ground by my company supply clerk, and there was a sidewalk, and the goal was right in front of the sidewalk, and I landed on the sidewalk, and I got a little cut right here, and I had blood coming down the side. So I looked, felt, and smelt like an infantryman in that moment. When the charge of quarters came out and said, "Sir, there's someone on the phone for you from Washington, D.C." Now, just think about that from, the perspectives, right? So I go inside, I take the phone call. It's my assignments officer, and he's telling me that they got a plan for me. They're going to assign me to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and they're going to make me a world-class Operations Research Systems analyst. And I remember, like it was yesterday, saying to my branch assignment officer, that's great. What's an Operations Research Systems analyst? I had no idea what I was getting into. He laid it out for me. He sold me the bill of goods. He said, hey, you're going to be living in Monterey. It's beautiful there. And I thought about where I was as a young officer with a young family at that point in time. It's when the phone call came, it was probably March of 94 or something, a couple more months there still. I had a kid, 94. I had a 4-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. I had been deployed. See, this is the perspective that people have today about the deployed force. No one would believe in the early 90s any human could be in this situation, but I had been deployed or gone from my family for about 14 months in the previous 30, And I thought, why not? I'll go to college for a couple of years and get smart and do whatever. So I took the assignment, and next up was Monterey, California.
How long were you in Monterey?
It was a by the clock 2-year program.
A 2-year program?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the 2 years, what is an operations research?
In a different academic world, it might be considered or called industrial engineering. Essentially, it was the Army's attempt at making sure that they had trained and then embedded within the force in certain places for different reasons somebody who understood stochastic modeling processes, simulations, probability and statistics, linear programming models, all those kinds of mathematical approaches to real world problems. And I got to tell you,
interested in that kind of thing?
Well, look, I was always kind of a math geek, and I went to West Point and got my degree in aerospace engineering because I knew I could at least survive in the math world. I had enough math skills I could survive in the math world. But once I entered the infantry and graduated from Ranger School and jumped out of airplanes and rappelled out of helicopters and got dirty, and I sort of left all that behind. I really didn't think I'd ever care to or do anything like that. The Army's pretty smart about doing that. I mean, it because what I would tell you sitting here today it was and still kind of is in the Army an important approach to rounding out an officer's development so that they do see other ways to come at problems, to process information, to solve things. And I got to admit, it was very helpful to me from that standpoint. It's not that I sat down with any of my infantrymen after that and wrote a linear program. That's not the point. But just the framework of good logical thought and scientific process and logic is applicable no matter where you go, including this place right here that I'm in now. So I'm very thankful that I had that experience. It was cool to live in Monterey, California. I couldn't help myself. I had to get back out in the woods. So I linked up with a special forces guy who was at the Defense Language Institute out there, and we started an orienteering club. And we used to go out to the old Fort Ord, which is right there. And we'd go out into the back training areas and set an orienteering course and run it. And people would pay us to go out and run around the woods, and we'd use the money to buy new stuff. And, kind of did that for a couple of years, along with studying my butt off because it was very demanding. It was a very demanding course.
Were there any memorable experiences from your time at Monterey?
Let's see. We won the Naval Postgraduate School intramural basketball championship. Me and 5 of my buddies. I remember that. But other than that, it was it was refreshing to get out on the bike path on the beach and run at lunchtime in a place like. It was a good chance to kind of uncoil from the first few years of the Army, and it's an opportunity that officers are given that non-commissioned officers are not, and that's a shame. But but I was thankful that I had it. The only memorable thing was determining where I would pay penance for getting that degree, because the Army's always going to squeeze another ounce out of you. So it came down to going to one of three places. I was either going to go to Central Command Headquarters in Tampa and be an analyst there, or go to the, and the name escapes me, it was like OPTEC or something, Operational Test and Evaluation Command at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where they tested parachutes, which had my attention, or go to the Pentagon. And I remember asking...
Did you get to choose, or did they choose?
Well, you put, like every other time, you put in your top three and you get one of them. And those were the top three that I was wrestling with. Long story short, I ended up getting assigned to the Pentagon. And I wasn't supposed to graduate until September. Here I go again, right? So at Fort Campbell, I was in a hurry to hurry up and get to the next level. So I dashed out the door and pulled that one off. Now I'm not supposed to graduate from the Naval Postgraduate School until September of '96. And I have to write a graduation thesis. So it's not like it's, here, take this quiz and then you can leave. So it's July timeframe, and I go on leave to Nashville, Tennessee. My thesis is probably half done, or maybe even 2/3 done. I don't know. And while on leave in Nashville, you got to remember now, I'm outside of the womb, right? I'm not in the normal Army. A, I'm at the Naval Postgraduate School. B, I'm a student. So I don't have a chain of command. I don't have an Army anything. My chain of command is literally at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where the student detachment is. But they just have a line to me is all. So whereas in a normal Army unit, when you're selected for promotion, your boss pulls you in and says, hey, congratulations, you've been selected for promotion in that grade. I didn't have any of that structure. So I'm literally on leave in Nashville in July. I've got 3 months to go at the Naval Postgraduate School. And I read in the paper, in the Army Times, that I've been selected below the zone to major. I've been early selected to major. So now my timeline has been accelerated again. In hindsight, I know that I was getting all wrung out over nothing. But at that time, I thought, oh man, I can't spend more time at school because now I'm going to be a major sooner than I would have been. And I don't want to, and I allowed myself to create all this anxiety, right? Professional anxiety. So I called, because I had already received my RFO, my request for orders, that I was going to be ultimately going to the Pentagon. But they didn't have me arriving until October. Yeah, October. I called, I said, hey, I just got picked up below the zone to major. Can I sign in sooner? And the whole sort of thing happened all over again. Sure. Well, now I got to go, but I'm not done with my thesis. So this is what I did. Or at least this is how I remember it. I flew from Nashville to Washington, D.C. They cut my orders. They signed me in. They put me on leave. I went back to California. I finished my thesis. I basically sat, I had a secret part of my thesis and a non-secret part, so I had to sit in the SCIF, the Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility, Intel Facility, to write it. So I was basically just ratcheted down, just getting it done. Finished my thesis, packed the house, packed the dog, drove across the Mojave Desert with the windows down on my Ford Explorer and a U-Haul behind me because the air conditioner broke. Picked up the family in Nashville and ultimately arrived back in Virginia to go to the Pentagon in, I don't know, probably August, after all was said and done.
So August of 97?
96. August of 96.
So what was your responsibility at the Pentagon? What were your duties supposed to be?
Yeah. Let me tell you an Army story first. So here's my first day at the Pentagon. No kidding. It happened just like this. So your orders say report in duty uniform, right? Or maybe it might have even have been more explicit and said report in Class A uniform because it was the Pentagon. This is before 9/11. After 9/11, everybody threw their fatigues on. Pentagon, Iraq, didn't matter. Everybody wore their battle uniform, right? Just sort of a mental set thing. But back in 1996, everybody was in there, So I dutifully put my whole Class A uniform together and drive into the Pentagon for my first day of work. Now, the Pentagon sits here. If you were to draw concentric circles around the Pentagon in 5-mile increments, you basically get rank. Generals live this close because they can either get housing on Fort Myer or they can afford it. Colonels live here because they can afford it. Majors. I was a captain. Soon to be promoted to major, but still a captain drawing captain's pay. So I ended up living in Centerville, Virginia, right by Dulles Airport. No kidding, I clocked it 26.2 miles away, which is marathon distance, which is how I always remember. It was like a marathon to get to work in the Pentagon and home every day for 2 years. Route 66 was like a parking lot. I learned all this the hard way. So now this is my first day that we're talking about. I don't know the traffic patterns. I don't know how bad it's going to get. I don't know that if you leave the house at 5:59, it's a 25-minute drive. If you leave the house at 6:01, it's a 55-minute to 1 hour and 15-minute drive. So I leave in the thick of the morning. I'm in traffic all day. By the time I actually get to the parking lot, every other parking spot around the Pentagon is pretty much taken. So I'm probably parked a good mile, if not more, from the Pentagon building in my Class A uniform with my nice little briefcase on a 100-degree August day in D.C. where it's humid. So I make my way to the Pentagon. I'm now inside. I'm already sweating. I've never walked around the Puzzle Palace before, so I have no idea how to get to room 2B730. Second floor, corridor B, room, second floor, B ring, 7th corridor, room 30, 2B730, where I got to sign in. So I finally find my way there. I probably could have got there in 2 minutes if I knew what I was doing. It probably took me 15 minutes. I get there, I open up all my stuff, I turn in my leave form, and all my other paperwork, and the young lady looks at me and she says, "It says here you did a do-it-yourself move. It's called a Diddy move. I pulled the U-Haul. So you get credit for that. It saves the Army dollars. If you drag it yourself, they pay you back for your U-Haul." I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I'm going to need a copy of your car registration." I said, "It's in the car." She said, "Well, okay, you're going to have to get it." So I zipped up my stuff, I went back to my car, and I went home. Because as far as they were concerned, I just had to check in that day, and I had accomplished that. There's no way I was going back through all that. I just drove home. It's 1:30 in the afternoon. Nobody's missing me. Nobody knows why I'm here, what I'm supposed to do, which gets to your other question, what did I do? So I went home. Just a no-kidding Army story. So day 2 and day 2 through day 730, I was assigned as a chief analyst to the director for military personnel management. 2-star billet, 2-star general, and essentially what I became was the special projects analyst because they really didn't kind of know what to do with the young captain. I'm telling you, I've said it 100 times, you can swing a dead cat in the Pentagon and hit a lieutenant colonel, but you can't find a young 03 captain. I mean, there's not just very few of them. Most of them are aides to some general somewhere. You know, I was actually a worker. So what did I do? I made coffee for all the lieutenant colonels. I made slides for all the lieutenant colonels, and I did special projects for my 2-star boss. But, you know, 2 quicks from that tour, maybe 3 or 4. But on the job side, again, a very enlightening experience for a young captain to come into the Pentagon and see how sausage was made. That cut both ways, good and bad. But I really learned a lot about Big Army. I actually drafted a chapter for the Army manual that they use at the War College with a lot of help. But I learned how the Army worked. And
Did you have
so
the
that
same
was good.
boss the entire time?
I did. I had the same group of guys around me pretty much the whole time. The colonel between myself and the general changed one time. both great guys, John Ward and Anthony Stamilio. To this day, I'm still in contact with Tony Stamilio. And, you know, just again, an eye-opening experience. And I did get to exercise the skills that I learned on, you know, statistical analysis and all that kind of stuff.
Was it like a typical 9-to-5 day job?
It was. It was an office job. I'd work out at the Pentagon Athletic Center, go for a run out around the mall, run out to the Washington Monument and back. It was great when you were there, but struggling the traffic to and from was not fun. I tried every commute way possible. I rode my motorcycle, which allowed you to get into the HOV lane. I carpooled. I used the Orange Line Metro, and I even tried once, but never again, what was called the slug line. The slug line. There's literally a procedure in the Pentagon where, so that people can get in the HOV line, people will stand in a line by a bus stop, and random singular drivers will pull up, say, "Where are you going?" "Vienna." "Get in." Now I can get in the HOV lane, and they would take that person to a drop-off point. Strange. There's protocols. You don't talk to each other and stuff. Weird. I did it one time, never again. But it was those 2 years were a real slog because it was office work, which isn't what I kind of was built for. The commute was terrible. And then in between, you know, I took on the responsibility to be a tiger den leader for the Cub Scouts, and then did Tigers the first year, did Cubs the second. So I'd pull into my driveway after a white knuckle trip down Route 66, and already standing in my garage are seven-year-olds bouncing off the ceiling, you know, and I gotta, "Hi guys," you know. Yeah, so that was that experience. And then, as I said, I had gotten promoted early to major, so the next pressing matter professionally was to get to the Command and General Staff College, which I tried to wicker into an assignment to Quantico. I wouldn't have had to have moved, and I could have just driven to Quantico. Just didn't quite work out. So in the summer of '98, we packed up and went to Leavenworth for the Army's Command and General Staff College.
And how long did you stay at Leavenworth?
That is a standard 10-month tour.
And what were you learning there?
It is, another sort of routine matriculation for majors to be prepared to become, as the title of the school says, general staff officers. To be a staff officer at the general officer level, basically for a division or a corps.
So was it all classroom training?
All classroom training. Not even a venture out for land nav. It was all classroom training all the time. Yeah. Nope.
When you finished that, was the idea you were going to become a staff officer somewhere?
Yeah, so although the school is named the Command and General Staff College, and it prepares you for division level and corps level operations and staff positions, the very next thing that most of us were destined to do was serve as a battalion operations officer or executive officer. The intent behind having you train for general staff is it's probably a 50-50 split between those who are able to go right into a battalion and others who have to bide their time on a division staff waiting to get into a battalion. I was fortunate enough that I was able to choose Alaska finally. So this time we went. My kids are now, 9 and 8 years old. And the extra added benefit is it was no longer, but it was a separate infantry brigade, which meant it didn't have the overhead of a division staff where you would have to do penance on division staff. So I knew I was going right into a battalion job right away, which is great. So we loaded up the Explorer and bought a pop-up camper and loaded up the dog and drove up the Alaska through Rushmore. Snowed on us, and this is June 6th, I think I graduated CGSC on June 6th, 1998, and on June 7th or 8th, woke up to snow on the camper at Mount Rushmore. It was the weirdest thing. and then just kept on going and drove up the Alaska-Canada Highway, the Alcan, all the way up to Fairbanks. Stopping at the hot springs, camping out, seeing bear. It was a pretty unique experience. And then signed into the 172nd Separate Infantry Brigade in Alaska sometime in late June. I think we took about 14 days to make the ground trip.
And how long were you going to stay here?
This was another 2 years. I spent a year as a battalion operations officer in 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry, and then I spent the second year as the battalion executive officer in that same battalion. And while there, the deployments included, what was called Northern Edge, which was an Arctic exercise where we would deploy out into the hamlets, the Eskimo villages, and conduct training exercises there, and a rotation to Thailand for an exercise called Cobra Gold, which is, I've lost track. It may not be done anymore, but it's been conducted every summer, every May, June, July, forever, and it's a partnership exercise with the Thai Royal Army. So that was cool. When we were stationed just outside of Bangkok, we spent some time in Phitsanulok. We spent some time out in the jungles in Chiang Mai, near Chiang Mai. Experienced some flash flooding. Luckily didn't experience any cobras. And it was a good training rotation. I mean, we trained the Royal Thai Infantry how we do platoon live fires. That's basically what we did through that whole time that we were there. And then it was right after that event in May, June of 2000. 2000? Yes. Wait a minute. So 1 year at Fort Leavenworth from 98 to 99, and then 2 years in Alaska from 99 to 01. Yeah, so in May of 2001, I returned, or June of 2001, I returned from the Thailand event and packed up again and drove to Fort Polk, Louisiana.
How did you like being a battalion officer up in Alaska the 2 years you were there? Anything memorable besides the terrain?
It was hard work. That's where the Army calls the field grade officers, the 04s, the Iron Majors, because really you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the planning and execution of training. So it was hard work. It was hard work. The other thing that I'll never forget is just how important discipline is when you are in an extreme environment. I mean, I'd been to the desert twice already, so I understood it from that standpoint. But there's no kidding around in Alaska. It sounds very basic, but it was a lesson that until you've actually learned it by doing, you don't realize just the risk involved. If you move too fast in your Arctic gear when it's minus 45 degrees out and break the slightest sweat, you're going to regret it as soon as you stop moving and it's 2 a.m. and you're sitting still for 30 minutes. So you really learn to respect the importance of protective gear when you're in that experience. I loved the outdoors. I loved being in the snow and the cold. It worked for me. It was a highlight of the assignment. I bought 2 snowmobiles. We'd go out and snowmobile by Mount Denali. In one day you'd see caribou and fox and bear tracks. Luckily we didn't see the bear, and just everything. It just all in a day's time. It was pretty amazing. So overall it was a good assignment. Yeah.
All right. What was your duty at Fort Polk?
So this became a transformative period. I was finally on airborne status, which, with my dad being an old master parachutist, I finally got there. I finally arrived in a jump unit, although it wasn't one of our premier tactical jump units like the 82nd Airborne Division. The reason that that the team at Fort Polk was on jump status was so that when we conducted training with units like the 82nd Airborne Division, we could jump with them and be part of the entire operation. But it was it was a life goal to finally get to be in that environment, so I was excited about it from that standpoint. The other thing that was exciting and enriching about it is until this last, and I've called it 10 years, 12 years, I don't even know anymore, but this last decade plus of sustained conflict that we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan, until that time, there was only one place in the Army where you were going to be in the field every single month for a couple of straight weeks, and it was at Fort Polk as an observer controller. You trained every brigade in the Army. They would all come to Fort Polk, you would train them, they would go back home, then you'd go out to the field with the next one, and so every month you were in the field, practicing your field craft, learning about your profession, teaching others how to perform better in the profession. So my job, having just come from being a battalion operations officer and executive officer, was to be a coach for battalion operations officers and executive officers from around the Army. It was great. It was great. And, we trained people for missions in Bosnia and Kosovo, and then just generic training missions. And I got a chance to go to Bosnia and get eyes on the situation there. So that was an interesting 30-day, a little less than 30-day exercise to see it in real life. And then this thing called 9/11 happened.
Yeah, because you got to Fort Polk in May or June,
Yeah.
and that's where you were. Do you remember where you were exactly?
Well, one quick aside. In March in Alaska was when I got a phone call from my dad that he wasn't feeling so good. He passed away in April of 2001 while I was in Alaska. And I've got a great USO story that I'll save for the time being, but the USO was there for me when I needed a place to go and hang my head low as I was trying to make my way home. I didn't make it home in time. He passed away. The reason that I bring that up is what I know now is that I wish I'd spent a little more time talking to my dad about his service to the nation, because his work in Vietnam was what I was about to embark upon in my time in Iraq. And I also know now, in ways that are not describable, the level of post-traumatic stress that he was living with his whole life and how it manifests and how he dealt with it. And I wished that I had my life experiences that I have now, so I could have had those conversations with him then. So it's September 11th, and I'm in the field with the 3rd Infantry Division. We're training a brigade. They are actually preparing to go to Bosnia. And I'm standing next to a tree in a small little facsimile shanty town that we developed for training called Jetertown. I can see the tree, I can see the town, and I'm standing with a couple of EOD specialists, explosive ordnance detachment specialists. Every single observer controller, there are probably about 250 to 300 of us on the ground. We're all wired in. We've got the best technology and the best communications because at all times we're responsible for tracking that unit and how they're doing, and they're sleep deprived and they're missing a kid. We're the fresh eyes that can keep all this figured out. So we're pretty well wired. And there's an operations center that can talk to all of us at the same time. Now, we're all on our own channels, but every now and then the operations center would break in on everybody's radio for important, hey, there's lightning, shelter, do this. The radio breaks squelch, and it's the Joint Operations Center, and they say, attention all observer controllers, there's something happening in New York City. One of the Twin Towers just fell. Because we're all out in the field. We're not glued to the TV set. We don't know what's going on. And I remember looking at the EOD specialist who's right in front of me, and he without skipping a beat, he said, "Sir, we're going to have to pack our bags and get out of here." Just like my story back in West Point. When, this isn't good. and the world kind of turned upside down at that point in time. And I did a few more rotations as what we used to call a ground OC, where you're actually on the ground training the rotating units, before my boss pulled me into his office one day and said to me, hey, what do you think about becoming Zulu 6? And I said, well, boss, are you asking me or telling me? And he said, I think I'm telling you. I said, okay, well, can I think about it overnight? He says, you can think about it if you want to, but I'll talk to you tomorrow. He wanted me to become the chief of plans and operations for the training center. And that came at a very, very important time, because we were getting ready to send guys, to prepare guys to send them to Iraq. So there was that.
What did you say the next day?
I said yes, and the rest is history, as they say. On the way to that happening, though, we actually were training the 75th Ranger Regiment when they, in the middle of the rotation, had a battalion get pulled to go to Afghanistan and conduct the night operation jump into Afghanistan. Just, there was a lot of real-world stuff going on at that time, and it was really driving the direction that we were going to take the training center. And boom, now I'm the guy in charge of doing that. So it was a super challenging, super exciting, super important moment in time. And I remember the day that I closed the doors on what was called Highland Hall. It was our planning bay. It was no bigger than this room right here, but it was a lot hotter because it was Fort Polk, Louisiana. And I basically did what the scientist did in the scene in Apollo 13, where he comes in and he wipes everything off the table and he dumps a bunch of parts on the table because the orbiter is lost and they got to get it back. And the only way they can get it back is by telling them how to take pieces and parts of what they have to repair the vehicle in flight. And the guy dumps everything on the table and says, we got to make this fit into this. That's how the scene in the movie goes. That's how I remember it going, because I said, look, this is a great training center. We do a lot of things right here. We got to change some things because of what we're going to be, what we're about to do. And it was a transformative moment. And I remember reading in an old book, and I copied it and I put it under my desk glass, and I'll be damned if I've ever been able to find the quote again. But there was a quote by, I think it was George Catlett Marshall, General George C. Marshall, testifying before Congress about the Louisiana maneuvers that were conducted for World War II in the swamps of Louisiana. And it caught my attention for a couple of reasons. One, I went to Marshall Elementary School at Fort Campbell when I was a kid. Just thought that was cool. And two, what he told Congress about how he was conducting the Louisiana maneuvers to prepare soldiers to go to World War II was exactly the pressure I was feeling and the way that I was reacting as I was preparing soldiers to go to OIF. They were alleging that he was spending too much of the Department of Defense's money. And he said to them, essentially, and I wish I still had the quote, Congressman, I would rather spend that money now in training than spill it in blood in war. And so as I was going about the process of leading a great team of combined civilians and military in doing this, there was a contract let to Cubic Applications Corporation, who helped us do a lot of the role playing. Because you're basically at Fort Polk, you are simulating an entire combat environment, from civilians on the battlefield to real buildings that soldiers have to enter to blast effects and simulations. It's almost like a little mini movie every month. And as comfortable as we all were with how it had been proceeding under its normal routine arrangement, we knew we had to tighten it up a little bit. And so I sat down with, and as the world would turn, a recently retired general officer who had taken over the civilian role of leading the Cubic side of our team. Well, that gentleman was one of the guys that I drove around and visited the night before the air assault in Iraq back in 1991, who is now my partner, my colleague, in crime in running the training center. And, we had one of those moments where sometimes the best things happen on the back of an envelope. And we flipped over a piece of paper and we said, there's this great urban training facility called Shugart Gordon that everybody raves about. But the fact of the matter is, it's 26 buildings in one place. The rest of the training area is woods. And that's not where our soldiers are going to be fighting in Iraq. They're going to be in Abu Ghraib, Habaniya, Ramadi, Fallujah, Sadr City, Kirkuk, Erbil, you name it. They're going to be fighting in urban terrain. We don't have enough urban terrain to train an entire brigade of soldiers. And I refuse to have, this is almost word for word, because I've said it enough times, and I'm not going to have a young National Guardsman from Arkansas run into a real live Iraqi speaking Arabic for the first time when he's on the ground, because he's going to think he's a bad guy right away. We've got to start inculcating or inoculating them to the fact that, look, there's good people and bad people, and they've got to be able to interact with them. So I spent a lot of the Army's money because, and there's a great guy who will be my hero for the rest of my life who I haven't spoken to in decades. He may have passed by now, C.J. McCann. That guy, all of us who have achieved things in our lives, we know that there's that guy that you can point at who really made it. C.J. McCann was the guy. And all I had to do was say, CJ, we've got 26 buildings at Shugart Gordon. I need 140 here on Fort Polk. And I think all I heard him say was, okay, boss. And the next day, I swear to God, I'm exaggerating, but it felt like the next day there were flatbeds rolling in with prefab buildings and boom, 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 boom. We started building what is now at Fort Polk as it's in a different place, and it's great. And we started hiring foreign language speakers, true blue Arabic speakers who, when a young soldier walked up to them and said, hey, I want to know where Muhammad is, would say, Wala Maraf. I swear to God, I don't know. But the kid had no... We created the environment. We did the best we could in creating the movie, the way the movie would play out for them when they were deployed. Proud moment, tough work, good stuff. I could talk about it forever. But that's what I did while I was there. And how did I get rewarded with that? I got rewarded...
2 years?
Yeah, 3 years. I did, I guess, about a year and a half on the ground as an OC, and then a year and a half as the chief of plans, and left there in May of 2004 because I got selected for battalion command. So I was now going to go command my own battalion, and the funny, very ironic thing about it was, and shortly after taking over my battalion, I was going to bring them back to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and be one of the trainees. So anyway, and have to get run through the grinder of the very thing that I helped create. We used to joke it was like being the Wizard of Oz, Yeah.
Well, how did you feel about becoming a battalion commander?
Every young infantry officer lieutenant's ultimate dream is to become his battalion commander. The guy.
Wartime too.
Yeah. Well, you knew you were deploying without question. So so I arrived in I guess June of 2004. Took command right away. The battalion had just come back from Afghanistan. It had been deployed to Dehrawu, Afghanistan, and Bagram, a couple places. And they lost a few soldiers, and they were licking their wounds a little bit, and they needed a break. And I was rip-roaring ready to go as a battalion commander, and I had to find that balance and all that kind of stuff, and yet at the same time had to take on the obligation to prepare them for their next fight in Iraq.
So this is a battalion that just got home from Afghanistan. They're going to get a small break and get trained and go back to Iraq.
Yep.
And you're going with them?
Right. Excuse me. Yes, and without muscling through the preparation, we had about 8 solid months of train up and prep. I went over in April of 2005 on a recon. so that I could drive the sector with the guys that we were going to relieve and get used to it, learn about it, understand it, and take it back to my soldiers and, give them one last touch of what I learned. And then I think we ultimately deployed in July. You see a lot of Julys. I missed a lot of my birthdays.
Huh.
I missed a lot of my kids' birthdays. I missed a lot of everything. But
where did you land?
We landed at Baghdad. No, we landed in Kuwait, and we did that whole. And so now here's the full circle, right? So I land in Kuwait, and I don't know how many of these you've ever done with guys who've been to Kuwait, but Kuwait is hell on earth. It is the worst piece of the planet, bar none. It is 130 degrees. It feels like all the time, and it's just not a pleasant place to be. And we used to joke that we think that was on purpose so that we couldn't wait to cross the border into Iraq and get into combat, because we would rather be in combat zone than be in Iraq than be in Kuwait. And then the oddity is, or the irony is, as I described, here I am, I'm a battalion commander, and I'm told, okay, over the next 7 days of acclimation and everything, you need to go to Udari Range. You're telling me to go to Udari Range. You don't know nothing. Right? I built Udari Range. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but I mean, there was nothing. It was a wooden tower and nothing when I was there in 1992, and now here I am.
Had it changed?
13 years later, not a whole lot, but there was a lot of infrastructure that had been created around it, because now they're constantly cycling brigades at a time in and out of there to get them to test fire their weapons and everything else. Yeah, I could tell stories for days. So we're there, and we get hot, we drink water, we get a little sunburn, we put the stuff on, we get used to it, and then they load us up, put us in a C-130 and fly us into Baghdad International Airport, where, I'm sure you've heard, you do the corkscrew, you do the combat landing. Nice, easy charter jet landing into Kuwait, corkscrew landing into Biop. Biop is Baghdad International Airport, where the C-130 banks hard, and instead of having a long, slow landing that gives somebody with a rocket a long time to track it, you start at, I don't know how many, 3,000 feet, and you just start going, land. It was a lot of fun. And set up shop, and my battalion of 660 men grew to a battalion task force of about 1,000 men and women. As we added a National Guard mechanized infantry company, we added, I've lost track. Well, a Ford support company. We added pieces and parts, and ultimately we had 1,000.
But you were only in charge
folks.
of your 160?
No, 660 were my organic soldiers. Four organic fighting companies: A company, B company, C company, and D company, and then a headquarters company. So 660 were my organic soldiers, but the size of my task force with all the attachments was 1,000. It was like 998 at its peak, I think, something like that. And we were responsible from everything west of Ghazaliyah, which is the western side of Baghdad, north towards an area called Saba al-Bor, Iraq, south towards Nasr wa Salam, and then back east through Abu Ghraib, Iraq. Yeah, and I mean, look, I have stories for days about it. This is the crux of my career is these tours that I did in Iraq. I'm not sure if we can do justice to that here today, but
You can start today. You're going to have to finish.
Yeah, I think so.
Where did you set up base? Was there a base already there, or a camp already set up?
You figured that this is now 2005, so we are 25 months past the initial invasion, and a lot of infrastructure has cropped up on the airport, creating Camp Liberty. So my soldiers were billeted in CHUs, containerized housing units, which are essentially like a 40-foot Connex mill van with an air conditioner stuck in it, with anywhere between 2 and 8 soldiers living in it. Lucky battalion commander, myself and my command sergeant major, we shared one. And we had our own running latrine in the middle, I'll admit that here, whereas the rest of the boys had to go to the shower trailer, next one over type thing. But look, at the end of the day, we were all living basically the same way, in that little container, Chewville. Far as the eye could see. I mean, you can go on Google Maps to this day, and I think there might be old images showing all of this.
How long did you stay there?
We were based there from arrival until July, late June, early July of the following year. It was a 12-month, 365-day tour. But I had a company in Sadr City across the river on the other side of Baghdad. I had a patrol base out in the farmlands of northwest Baghdad, where the remains of Matthew Malpin, an Army reservist from Ohio, were ultimately found. That was one of our tasks the whole time we were there, was to track down his remains and those who were responsible for capturing him in an ambush that occurred in April of 2004. That consumed a lot of our time and attention for all the right reasons. So we were on that task. And my battalion conducted a couple of out-of-sector air assault missions to go after bad guys down the Euphrates River Valley in what was known as the Triangle of Death. Some call it the Fias, Mahmoudiya, Yusufiya, Latafiya, Oesat. Bad place. In fact, the first time that I tried to convince my brigade commander that we needed to go in there, I was told something like, well, that's in the Marines sector. And then I was told by someone the Marines didn't even go in there, even though it was in their sector. And as time would play out and demonstrate, that was a place that we should have been going because a lot of bad was emanating from that area. So I'm sort of out of sequence here, but...
So go back to when you first got there. What was one of your first missions?
The very first mission was to prepare for the Iraqi referendum on their constitution, which is pretty historical. It's cool to sit here today and reflect back and think about the fact that we had a part to play in securing the neighborhoods for those referendums. Because look, anytime you have people turning out to a poll booth, a polling location, that is a target for an insurgent. A truck bomb, a car bomb,
So you had to do the
a suicide.
those.
We did all the security for all those locations throughout our entire brigade sector, but the whole multinational division Baghdad, led by the 3rd Infantry Division at the time, all over the country. And so we secured polling locations. We were ensuring that ballots got back to the ballot counting locations, that everything was on the up and up. It was a challenging time.
What was another one of your early missions?
Aside from that, I would say that really our mission was to aggressively pursue the high-value targets that we knew were operating in our area that were members of insurgent and Al-Qaeda cells.
Were you given intel that you knew specific targets by name?
We did. And sort of in the gallows humor side of things, right? Things that are deathly serious kind of take on their own sort of humor, right? Our number one target in our sector was a gentleman by the name of Muhammad Abid Afin. And if you say that name enough times, it begins to sound comical, especially if you speed it up. Muhammad Abid Afin. Remember the Muppets? The na-na-na-na, beep, 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 beep. Muhammad Abid Afin. We pursued him for a year until he was ultimately captured in a ditch near where Matthew Maupin's remains were found. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, can you describe, and there's probably no such thing as a typical day? Like, what time would you get up and what would you do? And
let's talk about the whole battalion first, and then I can talk about my individual experiences. So we had a very large sector to cover, and one of the difficulties and realities of fighting a counterinsurgency is that you cannot be everywhere all the time. And meanwhile, those insurgents are blending in with the normal populace. So it is sustained beat cop type of work. You have to be in and amongst the people all the time, or you're never going to figure anything out. If you just drop in and leave and drop in, you got to get to know the people. So my last, and maybe I can provide it to you. I've actually got the script of the last thing I said to my soldiers before we left Fort Drum, New York. And I don't think I've even said that in all of this. This deployment was with the 10th Mountain Division, 1st Brigade Combat Team. I commanded 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, Triple Deuce, 222. And in one of my last pitches to the boys, trying to rouse them up before we packed up and left, I said, listen, every day you're going to leave the wire, and every day you're not going to run into a bad guy. You need to be ready to shake hands with the good people, shoot the bad guy in the face. That's what I told them. And my point was, there are 100,000 good people for every one bad guy that's trying to hunt you down over there. And you got to be super judicious and careful. And this isn't easy. What I'm telling you is not easy. But back to my earlier point, the only way you're going to be able to figure that out is if you run with the fish, if you immerse yourself in the environment, so you can begin to get a feel. So I was death on my guys about don't sit on the base and eat ice cream at the new PX with the Baskin Robbins. Thank you, United States, for putting that here. Get your ass out on the street. And look, easy for me to say, but I am comfortable in saying that my soldiers, they ponied up and they put in long hours on the streets of our sector. And so to answer your top line question, every rifle company, every company in my organization typically had at least 2 patrols out on the street all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 365 days. I, as a battalion commander, some would tell you, overdid it to make sure that my soldiers knew that I was there with them as much as I humanly and possibly could be. Of the 365 days that we were deployed, we spent probably 21 days on the front end in Kuwait and maybe 10 days on the back end in Kuwait, so 1 month off of that. So we were probably operating out of Camp Liberty for 331 days. I'm pretty sure me and my security detachment that moved me around the battlefield were out on patrol 300 of those days. I didn't sit behind a desk. I didn't take reports over the radio. I was out there learning people, learning personalities, being where my soldiers were when they were in harm's way. Because that's the only way you can do it in this environment.
I think we'll end now and we'll pick up from this point.
Probably good. Yeah, probably good.